Welcome to our artist panel talk, Light as a Material. I think this would be a really good time now to remind everybody to please be aware and either turn off your mobile phone or turn it to silent. We don't want to have any awkward interruptions in the middle of the talk. Before we started the talk, I thought I should now just take a second to give a really big thank you to all of the Ausglass conference volunteers and staff for doing such a wonderful job of putting this all together. And also, of course, for sorting out the technical side of our talk, which I never would have been able to do. So thank you very much. Also, I think we should, I just want to thank as well the artists that are going to be speaking tonight, which Cinnamon Lee, Jonathan Jones, who have come to us from Sydney. Cinnamon just this morning, rushing in to get here, as well as Karen Cunningham. And I guess I'll thank myself as well because I'll be talking for walking across the street about 5 feet to get here. Okay, so is everybody ready? Get started? Yep. Okay. So just last week, which was about 7 or 8 months after I was actually asked to facilitate this discussion, an interesting thought occurred to me. Is light actually even a material? I was always operating under the assumption it was energy. But then again, I feel like I remember hearing somewhere along the lines it was particle, which actually does sound a lot like what matter is made of. So I was obviously very confused. It struck me then, having slept through science in high school, I was probably not qualified to host this conversation. Doing exactly what I would have done back then, 10 minutes before an examination I wasn't prepared for. I consulted the internet to find out exactly what light is. Because this panel is scheduled to go for 80 minutes, I thought I might just take 5 of them before we get started, just to get warmed up, and share with you some of the interesting things that I've learned. I apologize in advance to anyone in the audience who might be working in the field of optics, or really anyone at all in the audience over the age of 10 who might have even a passing interest in physics, because this is all going to be pretty old hat. So, scientist Dr. Craig Freudenreich of the eminent scientific journal HowStuffWorks.com says to really understand what light is and how it works, we first need to have a look at the history of our scientific understanding. According to him, the ancient Greeks were the first to have a real crack at explaining the nature of light, and most of their theories sought to describe it as rays. Around 500 BC, Pythagoras, he of the right-angle triangle fame, theorized these rays actually emanated from our eyes and upon landing on objects in space, stimulated sight. The philosopher Epicurus argued actually, no, it was the other way around, that these rays emanating from the inside of objects then moved in straight lines through space to our eyes. Later thinkers such as Euclid and Ptolemy were able to use diagrams to illustrate both how these rays bounce off smooth surfaces and bend as they pass through transparent mediums such as water, glass, and air, thus beginning to visualize the optical effects we now know as reflection and refraction. It wasn't until the mid-17th century, about 600 years or so after Arab scholars used geometry to describe larger phenomena such as eclipses, rainbows, and the borealis, that we began to think differently about the way light might behave. In 1694, Dutch mathematician/astronomer Christian Huygens published his undulatory theory, speculating that light forms when a luminous body, like the sun or a candle flame, sends a series of vibrations into an invisible medium called the ether, filling all empty spaces between objects. Not everyone was on board with this new wave theory, though. In 1704, Isaac Newton proposed a very different idea. Reflecting the atomistic and materialistic worldview at the time, he argued that the geometric nature of the laws of reflection and refraction could only be explained if light was made out of material particles, as waves don't really travel very well in straight lines. To prove his point, he famously passed a single white beam of light through 2 prisms, the first splitting the light into the spectrum of colors, and the second compacting it down again into a single beam. I was able to prove from this experiment that lights were all colors superimposed onto one another, and objects in space do not have color but reflect it. His particle theory was unable to explain other behaviors such as diffraction, interference, and polarization. Thus, the debate was put to rest for the time, and wave theory was continued to be developed over the next 300 years. Finally, in the earliest 20th century, the 20-something Albert Einstein was able to settle this debate once and for all, or at least for the time being, with his Nobel Prize-winning work on the photoelectric effect. By shining intensive ultraviolet light on the surface of metal, he observed some of its electrons being ejected from the surface, thus discovering the photon, the massless particle and carrying force of light, moving 300 million meters per second. In reflecting on the fresh dilemma this created for the wave versus particle argument, he said, "It seems as though, in regards to different phenomena of light, it seems as though we must sometimes use one theory and sometimes the other, while at times we may use either. We are faced then with a new kind of difficulty. We have two contradictory pictures of reality. Separately, neither of them fully explains light, but together they do." So I think this is a really important observation about light, not because of its role in creating the backdrops to special relativity and quantum mechanics, but in a wholly unintended way, as also because our scientific explanation of light is obviously important, but also inadequate to describe our complete human experience of it. As much as light might be a collection of one or more photons moving rapidly through space as electromagnetic waves, light is also equally a manifestation of life, healing, hope, truth, warmth, goodness, and even something divine. Almost every culture in recorded history has worshipped the luminous bodies of the sun, moon, the stars, and the stars through its dance, poetry, painting, and other forms of art in their own attempts to understand and explain it. As industrial society has advanced and the world of art has become more experimental and technological in its nature, visual artists have come to embrace this duality, using the histories of both our scientific and cultural insights to turn light into a medium which transverses and unites the physical, spiritual, and psychological worlds. So join me now as we welcome four phenomenal Australian artists who are pushing the boundaries of these dualities. Jonathan Jones, there he is. Yep, Jonathan Jones, Cinnamon Lee, and of course myself and Karen Cunningham. As we're going to have a discussion now about our own theories of light and how these play out in our practices. So that's it on the history of light. And yes, and so I'd like to we're going to start the artist talks now. And if you guys don't mind holding any questions or comments that you might have about any of the individual talks till the end of the session, there'll be about 10 minutes at the end for questions. Okay. Thanks, guys. Yeah. So first to be speaking will be Jonathan Jones.
Yurado marang mudigalang yuindi Jonathan Jones, paladu radri bog milore gibir. Mayan galang narambangu, gana nyadi galang, nyati ninjamala mudigalang yinabu dayandu. I'd also like to acknowledge yourselves for being here and allowing me to speak today, and talking, I guess, in quite a tangential way in how my work might have an impact across wider fields, I guess. So today I'm going to be talking quite specifically, I guess, about the way light has worked or has become, I guess, in a way, material. I guess it's interesting that we should probably question why we need to define it as a material as such, and just be careful or aware of the processes of packaging things and defining them within a material concept. However, for the purposes of today's discussion, it might work. I'm also quite interested in the properties and some of the concepts of around light and how it's been used, and how we can use it as artists. So within an Indigenous context, I guess our light has quite a particular way of operating. It has its own sort of cultural ways of working and understanding sort of affected our philosophies, both, I guess, in a pre-colonisation and a post-colonisation phase. I guess, for instance, within a Wiradjuri and a Gamilaroi concept, stars have often been understood as the campfires of our elders that sort of come together to form the Billabong or the Milky Way. which is quite interesting, I guess, in that convergence between science and I guess those more cultural readings, that those two things perhaps aren't as far apart as we often like to see them, where, today we actually do, scientists are looking at stars and using them as the way of looking back into the past, in the same way that that Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi people would look at the stars and read them as connections to our ancestors, as signposts, if you like, back to our past. However, what's quite interesting is within, I guess, a more colonial context, is that fires and campfires perhaps were one of the first ways of building a relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. For those of you who have probably spent some time reading some of those early colonial diaries and entries, for the most part, Indigenous people tried to dodge their invaders, and for a long time, fires and campfires were often the only means of actually sort of counting or building up a relationship with Aboriginal people. In fact, it was even along the east coast of Australia that Captain Cook, as he was going along the east coast, was noting that there were firelights constantly following his ship the whole way along. When in fact you go to speak to the oral history of those families along the east coast of Australia, and indeed people were communicating to each other and discussing the fact that someone was coming up the coast. Oh, I got to speak closer, sorry. There we go. That in fact someone was coming up the coast, and that in fact when Captain Cook finally did pull in to Kamei, or what we know today as Botany Bay, people in fact, which damaged his ego somewhat, completely ignored him. There's a whole number of accounts of the use of fire and the use of how it sort of used, I guess, within, I guess, an Indigenous context, and how it did capture the imagination in this somewhat romantic image here, which is down on the Merry Creek, down near of the Wurundjeri people down in Victoria. For me, one of the most interesting moments that light, I guess, plays a role, or a pivotal kind of becomes, I guess, an active agent, if you like, within this early colonial days, was in fact when people in Sydney Harbour first started watching the local Eora people come out onto the harbour in their nauis or their canoes at night and capture fish. And what people would do is, in their bark canoes, they would fill the base of the canoe with mud, have a small fire and a torchlight, and go fishing along the water. I should also, in fact, say that this image here is a image of the Awabakal people just up on further north from Sydney. So this isn't actually from Sydney, but it's the same process. And it was in fact Watkin Tench and a couple of other more sensitive people in that first, I guess, load of people to arrive in Australia that started to talk about this relationship of documenting those boats on the other side of the harbour and documenting these lights flickering in the harbour and moving across the space. What of course happens when you have a light on a body of water is that there is a line of reflection. So, and you can start seeing that line of reflection in some of these images here. And for me, it was that line, if you like, that started to formulate a relationship between people. It started to formulate, I guess, a dialogue that perhaps wasn't in words, that perhaps hadn't really physically occurred, but it was something that started to emerge, and perhaps it was, I guess, a way of judging these two worlds that were coming together. This, of course, just didn't happen on the coastal areas of Australia. People working in canoes with firelights happened right throughout, and this is in fact an image in the Murray-Darling River system, so where my family comes from, where people would again also pack their canoes up with fires and go hunting along and go fishing along the river. What I became interested in as well, I started looking at my own Wiradjuri language and started to look at this idea of this point of contact, or this direction, and the connection between light, which in fact within Wiradjuri is sort of defined quite strongly. So nalang is the word for light, and it's an individual word that can be used to describe light, or it's also a stem word, so a word that can be built upon. So things like nalang baramara, which is actually, baramara is to make, so to make light, so when starting fires is nalang baramara. But also you can see that the notion of how nalang can talk about the direction or a point in words such as, I lost my point, so in words such as nalang bara, which is the word to actually just make or sharpen a point, or to make into a sharp edge. Or nalang bang, which is a mountain peak when describing the shape of mountains. So nalang itself and that notion of light capturing a point or capturing a relationship starts to unfold itself even within the language. And it's from these ideas of light as a line, capturing a relationship, and this idea of the point of light becoming a way of connecting people, that I first started working with works like this, which is just a very simple work which was made with some fluorescent tubes. I was lucky enough to grow up in, well, like most Koori families, those people don't like throwing things out. So my pop had a whole range of things lying around, and started to work with just some fluorescent tubes and deconstructing those housings. And this work here was literally to talk about that notion of that line of light, that relationship that exists between two people or two spaces, or to start defining, I guess, the world that we saw ourselves in. Quite quickly, I guess I realised that this notion of lights in this sort of, I guess, more of a casual way, or this casual structure, perhaps didn't really communicate efficiently this notion of community and define what those relationships were and how they operated next to each other. So I guess I started working with forms more like this one here, which was a much more structured form. This is actually a recent work I was lucky enough to work on over at Auckland City Art Gallery, and it's currently hanging. It's been up for about a year now. I think it will come down soon. And this is in the foyer of their beautiful new gallery. This work, in fact, takes those former ideas of using, I guess, a line and the fluorescent tube expressing that idea of a line of light, but starts to look at, I guess, cultural patinations that exist within my regions. So for some of you that might be familiar, I guess within the southeast of Australia, a lot of design work is based on lineal patterns in the creation of diamonds, squares, a whole series of kind of, I guess, a visual vernacular starts being rolled out with the use of this line work, which then starts taking on, I guess, a whole new meaning for me. When you start being able to work with this kind of cultural impression or this cultural design and cement it within a space, it starts to inform the world around it, if you like. So you can see here that the ricochet of light that starts to occur throughout this building, because it's a foyer space, it's surrounded in glass. And in a way, it's that idea, I guess, that Aboriginal, or in particular Wiradjuri culture, can actually start resonating and start sort of rebuilding itself back into the world, or re-permeating back into new spaces. In many ways, the same way that starlight is still informing and still travelling, and the light and knowledge of those ancestors that we have is still formulating some sort of relationship with us. This, in fact, is a very small piece of possum skin pelt that's housed in the British Museum. There's only a handful of possum skins, historical possum skins, cloaks in collections. There's probably only about 5 in the world. But in fact, everyone within the southeast would have owned their own possum skin cloak, and they were designed inside on the skin side. Today, of course, there's been a fantastic revitalisation process and cultural revival process of making cloaks that some of you are probably quite aware of. This work here, I guess, starts to take these ideas a little bit further. This was, in fact, a specific commission I worked on for the National Gallery of Victoria, which which was quite an interesting process and way of working. The National Gallery of Victoria had never actually commissioned artists before. It wasn't in their policy to commission artists, so there was a number of issues that we had to resolve in relationship to how that worked. But this project was specifically commissioned 150 years to celebrate 150 years of the National Gallery of Victoria, and the commission was specifically looking at celebrating this man here, William Barrack. And some of you might know William Barrack was a Wurundjeri man, so a traditional owner of the Melbourne region. He, in fact, was there as a young boy when John Batman came into Port Phillip and signed a treaty. His father was one of the people who signed that treaty. So William Barrack, in fact, witnessed firsthand, massive changes throughout his country. One of the amazing acts that he and his people did was to settle a small Aboriginal farm or community called Corranderk, which is situated in the Yarra Valley, about an hour outside of Melbourne. And there the community thrived and did fantastically well. They were producing an enormous amount of, they were farming, working with their own traditional knowledge, so they were able to actually, they knew the weather patterns, they knew when rain was coming, and so of course they became excellent farmers, better farmers than anyone else in the region. And they were winning prizes at all the local fairs, and they were supplying a huge amount of material back into the local township. The Board of Protection, the Aboriginal Board of Protection, quite quickly came into effect, and one of their key aims was to dismantle Corranderk as a station. They were being probably too successful. And one of the major acts that they put in place was the Half-Caste Act, which was saw the removal of anyone of mixed descent from the community, which basically meant a lot of the young people were taken straight off the community, and the labour of that community collapsed, and the strength of that community started to become, they became much more vulnerable to other sort of legislations that started to take place. William Barrack led his community through these problems. He was an amazing man, and later on in life he became an amazing cultural orator and artist. What was interesting and slightly uncomfortable, of course, is that here was the National Gallery of Victoria. After 150 years, they were prepared to, acknowledge William Barrack. Probably 150 years too late, but I guess it was an uncomfortable marriage that they were trying to forge. But it was from his images and from his designs there that we started, and I was working with his family very closely, that we started to come up with this work, which was simply looking at doors, or they're kind of like, I guess, glass doors, which were constructed, seamless doors, and inside, obviously, there were these illuminating light patterns that were emanating out of these light doors. They were specifically constructed as, I guess, something that you would walk through. And in many ways, this man, William Barrack, he ran a whole series of campaigns against the government. He successfully campaigned against the government on a number of occasions. And he, in many ways, opened up a whole number of doors for his people and for Aboriginal people right across the country. He was an amazing activist. And so we chose that form of the doors to kind of represent the way that he was actually to pave new ways. And the space that this, I'll just go back a little, the space that this work normally occupies or was designed to occupy is in the stairwell. So again, it was a very deliberate attempt to install a work in a space that was neither here nor there, if you like. It was a transgressional space. It wasn't really the bottom floor, and it wasn't really the first floor. It's a funny landing, which if any of you who know that building, there's some odd little corners and crevices that the architects felt necessary to design, which probably don't really suit an art gallery at the end of the day. But in fact, this is one of the key points that if you actually put your back, if you've got your back to this artwork, you've got a direct line out to the Birrarung or the Yarra River. So it was a site specifically chosen by myself and Arnie Joy to place this work. Sadly, and the work also sort of quoted quite directly this southeast architecture, if you like, or building construction practices, which you'll see. This is an amazingly rare image of a Wurundjeri campsite taken by Fulcheray. A beautiful black and white image. It's a very rare image depicting a campsite in the southeast. And this image here, you can start seeing there's sheets of bark being lent up to create a whole range of, there's almost about 3 or 4 campsites in there. So it was that sort of lean-to like architecture, or ephemeral architecture, if you like, that we started to quote in the arrangement of these works. Quite sadly, quite interesting and sadly, but William Barrack's father set in motion quite an interesting prophecy, which was he announced to his community that he would die when the wattle bloomed. And sure enough, his father died when the wattle bloomed in August. Then, when William Barrack was getting old, he in fact announced that he would die when the wattle bloomed. And so, again in August, when the wattle bloomed along the river, he passed away. He had an infection, and it took hold of his body, and he passed away. And so every August, those lights, those designs that sit within those glass boxes, go down, and the work glows yellow when the wattle blooms in the landscape. So this memorial, if you like, starts to connect again with the landscape, and starts to connect again with those communities and with those philosophies and ideas. The last work I just wanted to quickly look at was this work here, which is a work I was lucky enough to work on with my elders from the Wiradjuri community of Wagga Wagga. And I know that some of you have probably spent some time in Wagga Wagga at the gallery there. And this is a work that we did at the local airport. So hopefully some of you will be able to see this. And it's a work that we started looking at, working with the elders who are very keen weavers, and they've been very much engaged in the process of reclaiming their weaving practices. And this work is a way, I guess, of capturing that memory of floating culture, if you like, and capturing, I guess, which was quite important for the local community, to capture a welcome to country and an acknowledgement to country. And this work was also conceived with 3 key elders, 3 key weavers from the community, and also Uncle Stan Grant, who is a language expert and a Wiradjuri language teacher. And he wrote this amazing welcome for us. But this work was really looking at this idea of the aunties felt it was a fantastic opportunity to show off some of their weaving practices, and they started to create a whole series of baskets of, if you like, luggage. We started describing it as, which was appropriate for that site. And then we started looking at, and we got that work sandblasted onto the glass there. And so this was a process that we then went across and did some quite you can just start seeing it hopefully, some very light hand tinting went over the top of all these designs, which were starting to build up these layers, or captured on these reflections or these panes of glass on the local airport. And you can see here that this is actually some of the actually there's quite a good image there of some of that hand tinting that we started to work with. And you can see in the background there also Uncle Stan's acknowledgement of country, but also some rules to engaging and living on and being respectful while being on Wiradjuri country. So a few, I guess, rules of living on Wiradjuri country. So this was I guess, a really important work for the local community, because obviously connected very directly with their local gallery, but also brought into the fold, if you like, the local community as well, which started to create a fantastic synergy. And from this point, there's been a fantastic relationship and dialogue that started to emerge between the artist and the community. I think I've hit my point, but that was I might conclude with that work, and if there's any questions afterwards, please let me know.
Don't have to put it down that far. Hi everyone, thanks. I just want to thank Mandi for inviting me to contribute to this year's conference. It's a real honour to actually be given the opportunity to speak about the lighting side of my practice for change, and also to a bit of a fresh audience. I hope you haven't all seen all this before. So I'm predominantly a jeweller, so that is to say that I spend most of my time making jewellery. I was trained as a gold and silversmith, so my medium is very much metal. However, not long after I began my career as a metalsmith, my attention also turned towards the wonders of illumination and the light object as a vehicle for expression. Consequently, most of my formal study has concentrated on lighting. It was interesting to stop and think about the topic today in relation to my practice as a metalsmith, given that metal is such a thoroughly tangible material, like glass, a material that can demand distinctly physical challenges, sometimes harsh and even brutal treatment in order to tame it. Whereas in comparison, light as a material, I'm going to call it a material, is so inherently intangible. Perhaps it is because of this very characteristic that it can be so powerful and so seductive. It can have such an impact on the environment in which it exists and on the people who inhabit that environment. So given the relatively short time frame today, I've just chosen to focus on a body of work that I made as part of my postgraduate studies at the ANU School of Art, which I completed a few years back now in 2010, so it's a little bit dated. I'm going to talk about the project using a few key pieces, and then I'm going to show a video that sort of gives a visual summary of that work. My creative practice is largely driven by process and a lust for knowledge, a desire to know more and understand more deeply. I like to get to the bottom of things and work my way up, and science therefore plays an important role in the research for both sides of my practice. As technology is so often a consequence of scientific inquiry, I'm also fascinated by the tangled relationship between humans and technology. I look to the future with both optimism and dread, but without fear. Through my work, I embrace technology in an attempt to expose its potential, or at least I try to exploit technology to express what excites me about it. Artificial light has irrevocably altered our lives, revolutionising our behaviour patterns and changing our relationships with nature and each other. Light continues to illuminate our means of accessing information as backlit screen displays increasingly become the windows through which we navigate the world. My initial attraction to light as a material was born from its unique ability to transform, in particular, its ability to transform and enliven the presence of the objects themselves that are delivering the light. Excuse me. This interest for me has evolved over the years to focus most acutely on the way the interactive interface between object and operator can enhance our relationships with functional objects and contribute to the future of the lamp as we know it. When I began my master's project, the initial aim was to produce a series of very stripped-back objects that expressed my scientific investigations of light and matter through their form, structure and functionality using primarily metallic materials and low-voltage incandescent light sources, kind of like this. However, due to the events that unfolded during the period of my study, changes became inevitable. Although my fundamental intention to make illuminated objects remained, two factors had a significant impact on altering the direction of my research and thus influencing the final results. The first of these was the rapid advance in the quality and availability of digital lighting sources such as high brightness LEDs and high power